You were expecting us to be in the bathroom? Hi guys, I'm Sullivan. If you're new here, and many of you are, I'm a floral designer and home gardener here in Philadelphia. I spend most of my time growing cut flowers for use in my garden beds. There are no straight cutting rows here. I completely understand why cut flower farmers grow in straight rows, but for me, my landscape, which is continually evolving, is about washes and drifts of color. And so I'm trying to grow as many varieties that I love as a floral designer in cut flower form to use in my landscape. If you want to go geek out with me about some of my other flower obsessions, I have a ton of videos about them. I have an amazing collection of peonies, roses, bearded iris, and I planted in the fall 2,500 spring blooming bulbs, which I am so excited to see. But I feel like the garden needs another layer. If you want to check out the renovation series, you can see that at the beginning of, right before the pandemic started in 2020, I took my entire garden back to a blank slate. And so I had always kind of hoped that I would be able to do what we're about to do, which is to layer into the bulbs some Ranunculus and some Anemones. Technically, because I'm in zone 7A, almost 7B, I could have planted these Anemones and Ranunculus out in the garden in the fall. But I would have had to mulch them very deeply and possibly even put frost cloth over them, and that's just not something I wanted to get into. It was a really, really long year for many reasons beyond just what I was doing in the garden. And I just thought, no, I'm gonna do this. We're gonna do it methodically. We're gonna treat this whole thing like an experiment. And so this is really part one. Last spring, I successfully grew anemones in the most lazy and bizarre setup you never saw. Because I was really just flying blind. It was, I had ordered them. They showed up with my tulip order. My fall 2019 was really busy. I pre-pandemic did that was a busy time for weddings for me, and so I was sort of scrambling to get these 50 anemones started, and they worked despite me doing many things that might have killed them. So this year, the goal is to be very methodical about the process. So this means we're gonna try the exact same steps that a commercial cut flower grower would follow to pre-sprout their Ranunculus and their Anemones. And the only place we're gonna deviate from their usual MO is when it comes to getting them out into the garden. So we're going to pre-sprout and work on them and then get them ready, and then they are just going out into the beds to party with the spring bulbs, the peonies, and the bearded iris, and everything that will start coming up. It's just like 9-10 weeks away now. Cannot wait. Step one with these anemones and ranunculus is to give them a soak in the tub. Why? Well, I'm glad you asked. These are plants. They're dormant, they're asleep, they have been dug and stored dry since sometime in midsummer to the early fall. Wherever they are produced by the people that grow for the various distributors around the world, they are flowering, they are left to collect energy through their foliage, and then once that foliage dies back, they dig them up, dry them out carefully, pack them, store them, and then they're sent all over the place. I got my 18 varieties from a wholesale supplier. This is a supplier that can get tens of thousands of them for a big commercial cut flower operation, like the Hot Top family, who I profiled last year. If you want to check that out, I'll put a link below and I'll pop one up here for you. They are pro growers. And my experience of meeting the different pro growers around the world who grow the flowers that I've been able to work with for the last 10 years is really what inspired me to try to grow these things. I find that while I have no interest in growing on a large commercial scale, I have such a deep appreciation for the work that goes into cut flower growing all around the world every time I try growing something new. And it has really given me a much deeper understanding about just the ebb and the flow of availability and pricing when it comes to cut flowers. And while my focus is on building a beautiful annual blooming garden with a variety of perennials and a mix of a few annuals, there is something just really, really rewarding about seeing these plants grow. So the first step in waking these babies up is to hydrate them. But really, instead of thinking of hydrating them, think about giving them an oxygen bath, which sounds very much like a spa treatment that I would enjoy. The water is the mechanism for delivering the oxygen. The plants are not actually taking on the water, they're taking in the oxygen from the H2O. So as the plants sit in the water, they are taking the oxygen in from the water and releasing carbon dioxide. Without fresh oxygen, the oxygen in the water will be depleted and the plants are basically swimming in carbon dioxide and choking, which really doesn't sound fun for anyone. So there are 3 ways to handle giving fresh oxygen to the plant. And the main way that I've seen cut flower growers suggest is to leave water running into the tub or bucket where you are soaking the tubers or corms. But this felt wasteful for me. I'm on city water, I have to pay for it. I have 18 varieties to do this with. I'm not gonna leave the water running for a week. It just does not seem like an efficient use of water. The second way that is suggested is almost as wasteful in terms of time and labor, and that is to change the water every hour. Which, with a ranunculus, which needs maybe a 3 to 4 hour soak, that's not too bad, but the anemones can take 12 to 18 hours, and I just do not have the time to change the water in these things 18 times. So the last way to add oxygen back to the soaking water is to use a fish tank bubbler. Fish in their tanks need additional oxygen added to the water. So after doing a little research and seeing some people using these really big bubblers for like giant fish tanks, I knew I didn't need anything that extreme. I have on average about 100 of each of the ranunculus in 10 colors, and I have bags of 250 for the anemone corms. So do not need some industrial Shark Tank sized bubbler. So with a little searching, I found this beauty for $12.99 on Amazon. Since I have 18 batches to hydrate twice, which we'll talk about a little later, I opted to get 3 of these guys so I could have 3 varieties going at the same time, and it was great. It was just what I needed. I got into a little routine. Since I had the 3 systems to set up to go, I would put fresh water in, soak the ranunculus for 3 to 4 hours, get those potted up and get the anemones going and let those go overnight so that in the morning I could pot those up. And so it really only took me about a week to get the 18 varieties done, leaving the house to go do other things. So starting with the ranunculus, after they come out of their bubble bath, I wanted to treat these like plugs. I had actually purchased right before everything shut down in March, I had bought some little 2-inch ranunculus plugs that I ended up using in my planters. So that they were already flowering at the first week of March, and they did fine through the whole month of March. And that's sort of what got the wheels turning, like, hey, maybe our temperatures aren't as hostile for outdoor growing as I thought they would be. So for the ranunculus, I took some pre-moistened potting mix. This is potting mix. It does not need to be the super fine seed starting mix, which is good because potting mix is a lot more affordable. And after I took the hydrated ranunculus tubers out, you put them octopus legs down into the cell with a little bit of soil underneath them, and then cover the top of it with additional pre-moistened soil. I have only misted the trays if I saw anything looking a little dry. These do not need to be soaked in water, nor do, because they're open bottom trays, you don't need to dunk them. This is actually pretty heavy, and I have only top misted it twice. And then you want to take the covered ranunculus and put them in a cool, dark place. So no grow lights are needed for this. All you need is a cooler place. As for me, that's a cool, dark corner in our basement. These trays were planted just 10 days ago and kept in my cool, dark basement up until today when I brought them up for you guys. I thought it would be at least 2 weeks before I saw any activity, so this tells me that they were ready to go. Here's how to figure out when you can safely plant outside. Ranunculus should be fine without protection 4 weeks before your last average frost date. Presuming that in most cases they're going to take about 2 weeks to sprout, you're looking at starting your ranunculus 6 weeks before your last average frost date. So I am almost 3 weeks ahead of that schedule. So I'm almost 3 weeks ahead of schedule, which without the introduction of grow lights or making cold frame quickly or tenting them, I'm actually just going to grow them on out here in the sunroom, and then we're going to try a few creative things inspired by last year's wacky anemone project, which just basically means taking the flats outside and covering them in a variety of cold protection cloths in a sheltered place. Why did I start them so early? Well, I had to make videos about them, and it does take some time to film everything, put them together, and I'm trying to do this as close to real time as you can to kind of show you the progress of all of these, because I also think it will be a really good review of the different colors, and we'll be able to see which ones complement the other varieties of flowers I have going on. And if you didn't want to do the propagation trays, you could also just put take a planting tray, put some soil in it, put the ranunculus on top of it, and grow them that way. You'll just have to kind of like tease them apart if they grow together. But keeping them in the cells, they're going to turn into little plant plugs. And I am using a fairly deep propagation cell. I can plant these guys out at the end of February if I keep some frost cloth on hand. I actually planted my anemones last year in January, and they lived to bloom amazingly. You just want to make sure that wherever you're putting them, whether you're keeping them indoors, you're putting them in a protected location, you want to make sure that they have really good drainage. I'm actually using trays that have drainage holes as well for these, based on several years of seedling and plant growth in the closed trays suffering damping off issues. I would rather use things with more opportunity for drainage. So you just kind of need to remember that when you're watering things. I'm trying my best to do this experiment without grow lights and without a ton of equipment, because I know many people want to enjoy flowers, and especially this year after the budget crunching of 2020, a lot of people are just not interested in buying a ton of fancy equipment to grow flowers. And so with that end, I have started to see more ranunculus grown available at nurseries for early spring planting. They were available end of February, first week of March at my local garden center, which is called Primex. It's in Glenside in Pennsylvania. And I had just popped in there to get some soil because there was buzz about things shutting down, and I just grabbed them for some color. And I'm so glad I did, because this is the time of year, especially when the planters, I would love to be able to fill my planters with some color following the holiday letdown of the undecorating. As for the anemones, they're still down in the basement. They get the same treatment after their 12 to 18 hour soak. How do you determine how long to leave them? I did experiments with the different varieties at 12 hours, 18 hours, and one batch I actually forgot to take out of the water for 24 hours. I didn't see a noticeable difference in the longer time. So to always err on slightly less soaking time than more. As long as you're adding fresh oxygen to the water, you don't really need to worry about them rotting. If you are leaving your ranunculus, if you decide not to add additional oxygen to the water, the ranunculus are more prone to having their little octopus tentacles break off as the oxygen in the water is depleted. So, or the whole thing kind of going mushy. So you want to be careful for that. So I understand not everybody wants to buy a fish tank bubbler, but this actually, it was kind of nice. I did it in here, which is my office / filming studio. And the pump itself is silent, but the little bubbling of the water, it made it feel like I had a little indoor fountain in here. It was kind of nice. And the cats were fascinated by it. I did keep my, I have an adjustable height table, kept it up high so the cats couldn't get in and start drinking. As far as the anemones go, they're going to take a little longer, and their pre-sprouting is almost essentially the same, except you really do not need to do propagation cells unless it's something you really enjoy. I mean, some people, there's just something very satisfying about it, popping a plug out, but because anemones are a little more challenging to identify a top and a bottom, since they just look like weird misshapen acorns, you can just spread them out on, fill a tray halfway with pre-moistened potting mix, spread them out, cover them in another layer of pre-moistened soil, and put them in the cold, dark basement. Based on my experience last year, I did half in the basement and half out in the garage. The garage is much colder, so I saw very little root growth on them. So I actually think erring on like a 40 to 60 degree temperature, if you can swing it, is probably going to be better. So essentially you're leaving the anemones under the soil layer. You will probably not see much in terms of sprouting coming up like you do on the trays of ranunculus, but you're gonna push back the soil and check on them periodically, and you're looking for little white root growth coming out, and you want to really let them grow a robust root system. And I think that that's why I felt confident putting them out in cold January, is because they started to show a little green. They had these really like half-inch or longer root systems, and they just felt like they wanted to grow. So on one of those freakishly warm days at the end of January, I just went out there with my little dibbler and popped them in. One of the reasons I'm trying to wait until the end of February to plant these out is because by that time, all the tulips and daffodils and bulbs that I have planted everywhere will be starting to at least show their growth. One of the things I ran into planting in January is that I was adding my anemone layer into some black tulips that I had already planted, and the tulips hadn't sprouted yet. So as I kept digging in with the dibbler, I was like pulling up my tulips. They all pretty much grew. I think I only really damaged one that I had to throw away. But by waiting to add them in as a layer in your planting until you start to see some spring growth from everything, it's going to be a little easier to strategically plant them. By the end of March, beginning of April, everything started to really mix together. It was really cool. So it's part of why it's kind of worth doing all of this work. You want to just keep an eye on your weather. If you're going to have a really, really cold spell where it's going to be in the mid to low 20s for a few days, enough to make the ground feel like kind of crunchy when you walk on it, you may want to give a little protection to these guys. And by protection, I don't mean building a tunnel or a hoop or anything. I mean just giving them a nice good layer of frost cloth pinned down to kind of give them a little bit of protection during those super cold temps. And then you can take it right off. Neither of these plants enjoy super hot temperatures, but especially the anemones. So by getting them out a little early, letting them get acclimated to the cooler temps, then once the soil starts really warming up, you'll see the growth really kick in. And we may have flowers a little longer doing it this way. And that way, by trying to push the week of planting as early as you can safely without ruining the plants, the idea is that if we get a really hot June, because sometimes by the end of May, early June, we have days heading into the 90s, that's gonna halt bloom on all of them, stress the plants, and you're probably gonna be tapped out of blooms following that. So by starting a little bit earlier, working with slightly cooler temperatures, but growing them on in the ground, hopefully we'll get to enjoy the maximum amount of flowers. I would say I'll be excited if I got about 8 weeks of anemone growth from last year's, and I would be really excited if I got 6 weeks from this first round of Ranunculus. And I said first round. So because I bought wholesale grower quantities, I had 250 of each anemone color, and I had 100 of each Ranunculus. And so I did not start every single plant that I have. I held back about a third of each bag. At first I tried to count it, and then I just realized it was hopeless. So I started eyeballing it, but each variety I got 72 or more cells from it. So by keeping back a third of the supply, I'm actually going to do the whole bubble bath thing again in 4 weeks and do a whole other round of pre-sprouting. But at that time, I will be able to pre-sprout and just take them straight outside. No like kind of weird holding pattern or frost cloth wrapping or anything like that. And that's again to see if I get a longer flowering season by doing this, which of course the main impact on your flowering season is not when exactly you start them, but what your weather's doing. Since if you've ever tried to start dahlias early to get earlier flowers, if once they go in the ground, the weather is not cooperating, you're still not going to get flowers. The tubers don't really care when you told them to wake up. It's the soil temperature and the air temperature that kind of tells them to start growing. So the last thing about all of this is that I would like to try to turn these into perennials if I can. And that will require, after making sure I like everything, I like the placement of everything, after they flower, I will remove all the flowers and leave the foliage. And after the foliage dies back in the true heat of summer, just kind of like let it go. And then next year's plan, well, I guess we'll do that when we get there. As a home gardener, there's sort of a limit to how much you can dig up and store. And while buying them at the large quantities that I did of I bought a couple thousand altogether, they were certainly more cost effective than ordering a bag of 10 or 15 or 20 from one of the bigger websites. But you can find almost all the colors. You can find a version of it from some of the big plant distributors. I do hope that as more people show an interest in these plants, that we'll start to see more of them available either in nurseries for container use, or you start to see a wider variety of the specialty colors become available. So I have absolutely no idea if the perennial thing will work, but it's worth a shot since I have so many of them, and I don't think that I would buy or do this many again, but I really wanted to experiment with. I have an array across the different types of both anemones and ranunculus, and I really want to see how they do. And there's something nice about being able to go outside and getting florist quality flowers from your garden which was something that I can't say was really my intention pre-pandemic. But now that YouTube and gardening has become such like a big part of my world as weddings really shift and change, I just kind of want to grow as many things as I can and as many as I can afford to, and make pretty arrangements and keep sharing the process with you guys. So I heard from a lot of people when I was posting about this on Instagram that people are anxious or nervous about starting these, and I totally get it. They are special flowers, and I find that home gardeners, when they're really excited about something, they get very stressed about how to make sure they're doing everything perfectly. And so I think this is a great way to give both the anemones and the ranunculus a great start for your garden. And then you kind of just have to put them out in the world and see what happens. One of the nice things about starting these slightly early is that they are not interfering with any of my seed starting plans, which I am still figuring out. I do know that last year I started my seeds way too early, so these might be slightly too early, but it allows me to kind of flow out the amount of stuff I have to work through each spring, and it's just been really fun. There is something kind of gratifying and amazing about seeing green start to happen again. It's not that nothing's growing outside. My hellebores are starting to come in. I started to see some of the first daffodil foliage pushing up, and it is the end of January. So, I know spring is just around the corner, but there is just something kind of amazing about seedlings and plug plants, and now these little baby ranunculi. I think that technically is the plural for ranunculus, but if you can't say it, just call it ridiculous, which is what both my niece and my father call them. The reason for growing the anemones is just I love them so much, and after having the experience of growing 50 last year and getting, each plant must have produced 15, 20 flowers. And it's a flower that I really associate with the beginning of my floral design career. I have them tattooed all over me. It was a flower that I really gravitated to when I was able to first start shopping in the flower market 11 years ago. And they're a flower that just has some flowers have character. They have almost personalities. Like tulips will kind of be photoreactive. Anemones are similar. They'll kind of follow the light, and they stretch from the neck. And they have, I always used to say they have this ruffled collar that looks like, a chic French girl with a perfectly tied scarf. So maybe it's just me, but I do think of them as having personality. So the anemone is just a really significant flower to me, and being able to grow them myself and have them during the early part of the pandemic to cut and enjoy and kind of stalk, because I can't wait till we get them outside and you guys can see how they grow. But you see the flower form, and the flower is then this tall. And for me last year, I did not know how they grew. So I was like, did I do something wrong? Are my anemones going to be a half an inch tall? No, they grew to normal stem height. But the bud forms completely at the base of the plant, which was really cool to see. So obviously I have seen lots of ranunculus grow. I have filmed with the Hata and Sons team on what I hope someday will be a series of grower profiles, but they grow immaculate ranunculus. So I don't have the same perfect plant expectations for my own, but that's also the other thing I like about being an experimental home gardener. The flowers are slightly more disheveled in my world because they are not in straight rows. They get tangled up and things like that, but it doesn't make them any less beautiful. And if anything, it's even more fun to kind of walk around and design. If you're planning to grow ranunculus or anemones, leave me a comment below with what you're trying, or if you've had success in the past or struggled. If you need to know where your average last frost date is, I will put a link to that below. And I'll put a link to some of my favorite supplies for the growing. And I'll definitely include a list of all the varieties that I have been flashing up on this screen. So thank you guys so much for watching. If you haven't already, please subscribe. The cats and I really appreciate it. In light of the pandemic, my business really has changed over the last year, and YouTube has been a really great outlet for me to work on all of these things that I would be doing anyway and share it with you guys. If you want to see the flower arrangements that I made from my garden all during the pandemic year, you can check me out on Instagram. It's at Sullivan_Owen. And subscribe, because I'm going to be doing Ranunculus and Anemone updates basically every time something happens. So thank you guys again for watching, and I'll see you soon. Oh, and spring cannot come soon enough, right?